Hi, I'm Jim with Twisted Hobbies, and today we're building the Crack PittsXL. Okay, these are the tools that I use for doing a standard build. We'll start over here. I've got some batteries for weighing down the ailerons and the rudder and elevator. When you fold them over to loosen them up a little bit, then we'll keep those on for about an hour. I have some parchment paper that I use so that way I don't end up gluing anything to my work surface. I have some precision pliers, a precision screwdriver set, a whole bunch of adhesives. I have CA glue, I have kicker, I have foam tack. I also use foam cure sometimes. Some people use welders. It's up to you which ones you use, and you'll begin to like some of them more than others. Over here, I've got a drill and some drill bits. I use that for doing the landing gear and the wheels. I always print out the manual. I find this really helps me because then I'm not going to end up getting glue on my computer or my iPad trying to look through it there. I get the Twisted Hobbies power combo because everything works, it always fits, and it's great to have it all set and ready to go from one place right when I buy the plane. I also have a transmitter set up with a blank model ready to go. It has everything zeroed out. It's ready to get bound. Over here for measuring, I have some calipers. I have a square to keep everything perpendicular and a tape measure. Here we've got sandpaper, Velcro, some tape, some marking tools, and an O-ring installer. I always start with a fresh X-Acto blade, and then I have a couple spares handy so that way I can swap them out if needed. I got a pokey tool and a pin vise for drilling small holes, push pins for holding things together as the glue dries, some cutters for the carbon fiber rods if I have any, and then a lighter for doing heat shrink, and paper towels because you're getting glue onto your hands and so you're able to get it off real quick. This is what I use. Everybody uses something a little different, but this is what I have found to really work well for my process.
I am so excited about the Crack PittsXL. So let's take a look at it. First thing we're going to do is get our wings out, get them folded over. We want the ailerons to loosen up a little bit. The manual says to do that for an hour. Some people leave it overnight. I do it for about an hour. So while those are folding over and loosening, we're going to plug in our power combo. So first thing, I have a bind plug in there. I have a blank model. I go down to bind, and mine is set up so that all I have to do is hit the button and it's going to bind. Next step, I'm going to take off the bind plug, and then I'm going to take my, if you notice, when I move the throttle, nothing happens. It's because I have a throttle lock. Everybody should. It's a safety feature. So I move that switch up, and then I move my throttle all the way up, then plug it in. It's going into an ESC calibration mode. I bring that all the way down, and then it will reset. So that's a good sound. Looks like everything is functioning like I would want it to. I got ailerons, I got elevator, I've got rudder. Okay, now let's check and see which way that motor is rotating. So I put a piece of tape on it just to tell. It's kind of tough here because the video makes it look like it's going counterclockwise. It's not. It's going clockwise, so that means I need to switch up two of the leads. It doesn't matter which two, any two will do. Once you get those switched up, I'm going to plug it back in. You might be able to do that plugged in, but I don't. Now we test it again. And now it's going counterclockwise. So, my power combo is all ready to go. I'm going to shut that down. Now I'm getting out some parchment paper because I'm going to be doing some gluing and I don't want the glue getting onto the table. I'm using foam tack to put these together. I'm putting it on, letting it air out a little bit, and then moving them together. Now we've got the wing spars out, and we're going to scuff those with some sandpaper, and then I'm going to wipe them down with alcohol. Once they are free of all oils, then I'm going to cut channels for my wing spars. I didn't have any long T-pins, so I just used these paper clips that I sharpened up. Now we're going to cut the channel, and I cut it at 6 millimeters, and I use a piece of tape as like a guide over the top of the X-Acto blade. So that way I'm only able to really push in about that far. And that helps to make sure that you're keeping your channel the same depth all the way through. And I use a little stabby motion. And I did not cut these far enough. I should have cut them further. I go back later and cut them all the way to the edge. I wouldn't cut them to the edge. If I did it again, I would stop about a 1/4 inch short of the edge when cutting these channels. Making sure they're lined up. You have to push a pin all the way through to be able to get both sides of this one. So I've got them all cut. Now I'm doing the dry fit, and I should have started with these about a 1/4 inch in on one side, but I didn't. I went all the way to the end, which means that I have to trim both ends of all 4 spars. Whereas if I would have just started in a 1/4 inch, then I would have only had to have trimmed the one edge. So I've got some more parchment paper underneath because I'm going to be running glue all the way. Got those ends trimmed, so that's how far I should have cut the slot. Now I'm ready to glue, and I'm going to fill these little bottles that I have. I got these off Amazon. They have a precision tip, and I find that that's much more helpful than the tip that comes with the bottle because over time it gets pretty crusty. And with these little bottles, I just throw them away when I'm done with them. Now they're asking for some quarters. You need $2 worth of quarters, 2 under each of the tips on each side when you're gluing the spars on the tops of the wings. So I'll put those quarters underneath there and there as well. And then I'm running my medium CA into there. Hit it with a little bit of kicker and it cures instantly. Now we're going to be working on our servos for the bottom wing and our gang horns for both the top and bottom wings. I'm getting them cut out, getting everything set out. Once I got those cut, I sanded them a little. And I've got the servo horns mounted onto the servos. We're going to flip over the bottom wing and test fit these. They're going to need a little bit of cutting to give them some room. And we're also going to need to cut a slot for the wires that are going to run through the wing. I measured those wires at 5 millimeters, and I wanted to match that depth to be able to get them just flush. So I cut that slot and then buried those wires. They're going to go through that little hole eventually. And now we're going to glue in the aileron horns. Get them situated. I don't think I dry fit these before I put them in. I should have. Working on the gang horns. These are going to go on both the top and bottom wings. And the manual does a good job of showing how to mount those. cutting the slot. Again, the dry fit is key because once you get glue on it, it gets pretty messy, and having to mount it and unmount it becomes a problem. And then you get glue on your graphics and stuff gets smeared. So dry fit and then glue it in permanently. And now we're going to move on to assembling the aileron linkages. We're going to cut this little bolt in half. We'll first cut the head off and then cut the bolt in half. And then we'll be able to thread it on and get it hooked up between the aileron horn and the servo horn. It uses these teeny tiny end links. The thing that I like about them is that they have zero slop in them whatsoever, which makes for really precise flight. They do take a bit of practice to get them on right. There's kind of two clicks that you'll feel. You'll feel one click when you squeeze it together, and then you kind of have to offset the pliers to the edge, and then squeeze it a little bit more and you'll feel it click home. So doing the gang horns on the top wing, again, dry fit them in there, cut the slots in, make sure they're good, and then just glue them in. For this, I'm using foam tack, making sure you're not getting any glue into the ball link on those. And those are looking great. Next, we're going to work on the fuselage. So we have some stiffeners that we're going to need to run down the entire length on the top and bottom, and then go back and forth. But first, let's do that firewall. I'm going to use foam tack to get that set in there. And I'm going to put it just off the edge of the table so I can keep the rest of it flat. Put these in and then cut them off at the appropriate length. Turn it over, same thing. And on these, I wipe them down with alcohol. I wipe them with a little bit of sandpaper, just a little bit, just to get them scuffed up. I've never had any problem with these breaking loose. So dry fit. That one didn't go in flush, so I had to use my X-Acto and get it all the way in there. And I used the cutoffs from the ends to start putting those in, and then just use the other lengths to cut as I went down smaller and smaller. Once it's all dry fit in there, we're going to be putting some CA glue. I'm using thin CA on this one. Something I should be wearing is some safety glasses. When working with CA, you definitely don't want to end up with this in your eyes, and that would definitely help protect me. And then using my screwdriver to push it down flush. I wouldn't recommend using foam tack on something like this because it kind of gets everywhere and it gets on the graphics. I suppose there are ways to do it, but for something like this, I do like to use the thin CA. Just make sure that you're not gluing it down to the table and that you have some parchment paper or something underneath. Then we're going to set that aside and let it dry, keep it flat, and we're going to move on to the elevator. Cut apart these supports, sand them up a little bit, and when we put these in, they're different. There's one on the inside, one on the outside. I use foam tack to get these onto there. And again, dry fit these before you just go to town. And get those in all the way flush, and they look good. Now we're moving on to the bearing blocks. And this is for the elevator. This is a fully floating horizontal stabilizer is what it's technically called, and it provides so much more authority on the elevator. So I have that ready and set aside, and now we're cutting apart the main fuselage. We're going to be gluing the bottom fuselage up to these balsa ply pieces. And then those are going to be the supports that go all the way through the plane from the bottom of the gear all the way up to the top wing. So putting on some foam tack onto each side of these. And also make sure that your graphics are lined up before you put the glue on it and put it all together. You don't want to have that in there backwards. People will point and laugh at you. I'm using this other ruler here to make sure it's all lined up. And then I keep it all flat. Now we're putting the bearing blocks onto the fuselage because it is dry and ready to go. Measuring it so that it's centered. And then I'm going to use some medium CA to glue that into place. I could probably use foam tack on that as well. I'm just squeezing it together to make sure it's set, and also don't get any glue onto the tube. And here I struggled to get this all the way in, and then once I got it on, I realized my mistake. You guys will probably see my mistake. This is not the way to mount an elevator. This should be the other way around. But I get it on and then I go, oh no. So then I have to put it on the other side. Then I'm going to use a piece of carbon fiber that's 0.5 millimeter wide as a spacer to make sure that it's the right distance between the bearing block and the elevator, and then I go ahead and glue that elevator tube in place. This is the same as on my Rivolto, and I really like how it works. Now we're going to start working on the landing gear area. It's not quite the landing gear, but it's the bottom of the plane where the landing gear fits through. So you can see I have some black pieces there. Those come in your kit as yellow because they are G10 or little fiberglass, and I just hit them with some black spray paint in order to make them match the rest of the plane. So I'm cutting the foam. I should have cut this foam just a little bit more to make sure that it had enough room, but it has to be flush with that area and those have to fit on. And so I just used X-Acto to open those up a little bit, put in the foam, and then put on the fiberglass pieces. I'm going to repeat the same thing on the other side. It's like a little glue sandwich. Got that into place. I actually put a clamp on this off camera to make sure that it was all pressed together correctly. Now I'm finding my elevator servo and extension horn so that I can get that mounted. And on this one, they have you open up the hole a little bit on the extension and then screw it together and glue it as well. We get that mounted into the fuselage, making sure it's flush and making sure that the servo horn is coming out of the top of the plane. Then we're going to put the bottom fuselage into it as a dry fit, make sure everything looks like it's going to line up correctly. And then I just pulled it up a little bit and was able to add the foam tack underneath. Forcing it together, using my square to make sure that it's all going to be perpendicular. Now we're using the top fuselage. We're going to glue that together, and we're also going to cut it apart so that we can get it between those balsa plywood pieces that go all the way through the plane. At this point, we need to mount our rudder servo, and I lost my screw to hold on the horn, so I had to go on a side quest to 3 different hardware stores to find an M2 screw. Still couldn't find a machine screw that was the right length, so I had to cut it down. Huge hassle. The big takeaway is don't lose your servo horn screw. It's an M2 if you need to get a new one, by the way. So, gluing the upper fuselage onto the firewall and the vertical balsa support, and then all the way back. I use the edge of the applicator tip to spread it out. That way I don't have to use something else that I throw away every time. And then I wanted that to stick together just a little better, so I put some rubber bands on it. And then making sure it's all perpendicular using my square, and I'm ready to move on to my rudder. It's a little tough to see the rudder hinges because they're whitish clear, so I was able to locate where those were supposed to go. I was a little concerned. I was thinking about putting in another hinge in here, but there's also a bottom piece that helps to reinforce that whole area. So I line it up and then use that as a guide, and then line it up again, and then use that as a guide to push it all the way in. Get it centered, and then get some CA glue inside of each of the hinges. Now I'm ready to work on the tail wheel assembly. So we get it cut out, folded together. It's cool how it folds up. And put the axle through. You have to widen the hole just a little bit, so I used a pin vise in order to open that up. And you get it all set. Make sure you don't reef down on it too hard, because it's got to be able to move, obviously. Then when I lined this up, I realized that it wasn't going to line up. So then I had to do some cutting. Sorry, I kind of blocked it a little bit there. So I had to cut it out a little bit in order to make that work. Not too big of a deal. And I used foam tack on these, and just making sure there's enough room to get it into the correct place. Okay, then we're going to work on the horn for the rudder and the push rods. So I'm cutting apart all the push rod guides and dry fitting the horn for the rudder. And then I push my push rod guides in, get one end of the push rod glued on, want to make sure that you don't get CA glue into the little hole that you have to push the end link in through. And then you mount this in order to make sure that you can cut it off at the right length. So it's mounted permanently on the back side. And they say dress it up a bit, and that means you need to sand it to make sure it's going to be able to go into where it should go. And it's a little bit of a tight fit. I got it in, and then I just pull these out just a little bit, put some foam tack in there, and push them right back down. Make sure that they're all straight. You don't want them being off center and binding up. Now we're going to assemble the elevator push rod, and they have you screw the little brass piece into the end link. Make sure it's in about halfway. And then install it onto the horn. We're going to attach the portion that goes onto the servo with CA. I hit it with CA and kicker, and then you line it up, cut it to length, and then glue the other end as well. So I get it installed, I put in the little brass pin, glue it, and we are done with the elevator push rod. Next up is permanently affixing the elevator torque tube horn. So I get that glued in, and I make a little bit of a fillet with the CA, so that way it's nice and stuck in there. And then we are ready to attach the bottom wing to the lower fuselage. We're going to pull these all the way through, and then the wires are going to go on the left side. There's a little cutout for them. Get a dry fit done, and then apply glue. I'm using foam tack here, scuffing up the areas that I know are going to be glued. I guess I didn't have to paint those parts, but it's painted. And then I'm going to measure from wingtip to elevator tip on both sides to make sure that that's the same length. And then I'll do the reinforcement of the interplane struts with the carbon fiber supports. And I'm going to use CA to glue those in. Those will go between the wings, and they'll be arched forward or tilted forward between the top and bottom wing. The bottom is different than the top on those, so make sure that you're getting it lined up. Then I get everything dry fit. Once I get it dry fit, you pull it apart, you glue it back together. Getting glue all on that top piece, and those balsa ply pieces go all the way through to the top. Now we're ready to move on to the landing gear, and I'm going to use the calipers to mark the center, and then I'll use my pin vise, and I'll start with a tiny drill to drill a little pilot hole, and then I'll work my way up. I'm also using this block of wood. That way when you drill through it, you don't drill into your table. So I incrementally make those holes bigger and bigger. And then this little fiberglass piece needs to go inside of the gear, and it took a little sanding and a little moving around to get it all the way through, and I had to take it in and out of there many times. I also painted it. I don't know that you need to, but I like the look when it's a little darker and doesn't stand out. So we're going to mark where those screws are going to go through. And again, I use my pin vise to get a little pilot hole going, and then use the drill to incrementally step up into bigger and bigger holes until they're the correct size. So we get that through, and then we use the previously drilled holes to mark where the holes in that little landing gear plate are going to go. Those holes are just a little bit smaller. Then we do a final fit up, get all of it through, and then we're going to be screwing it all together and then gluing it. Once that's all screwed together, we're going to start work on the wheel pants and attaching the wheels to the gear. Cut apart the pant supports, sand those up a little bit, and then start assembling the wheels and their axles. Drill them out to 3 millimeters, make sure they spin freely, get a washer on them, and then attach them to the gear itself. There's a little hole on the front of that pant strut letting you know which one goes on which side. And then we're going to install the acorn nut. Onto the inside to finish it up. It's kind of a balance between having it be the right tightness and tension and having it be too tight and not letting the wheel freely move. So it takes a little bit of adjustment. Then we're going to assemble the pants. We'll glue them together. I kind of have to line them up and then visualize where they're going to go to make sure I don't accidentally make two that are on the same side. Glue them together, and then we'll be attaching those once we have them all dry. So now we're working on the gang horns. We're going to pull these little pieces off of the ball links and then attach them to their carbon fiber supports. These get screwed into the end links. You screw them halfway in so that way you have adjustment both directions if you need to. So you adjust one end of them and then get them glued on. Again, make sure you don't get any CA glue inside those end links, otherwise the little brass pin won't fit right. Now we'll attach the gang rods to the top wing. We'll let them hang down. We also put a clamp on the end of the wing in order to make sure it's flat on top. And then you clip it, dress up the end, and then you're going to glue these together. I like to use a little piece of carbon fiber rod that's separate in order to sort of touch it with like a half a drop, because sometimes the applicator on the glue bottle does not help with how much it puts on. And so being able to use a little piece of carbon fiber to do it a little bit at a time is a big deal. I accidentally cut this one a little short, so then I had to unscrew it a little bit. I measured it with the calipers. I think I'll have to go back and adjust this again in a little bit because I didn't get it quite right. So now we're working on the side force generators. This is a good thing to hold off until the very end, because otherwise when you turn the plane upside down and rest it on its wing, you end up squashing those. So make sure you put a battery or two underneath those when you're going to be working on it once you put the side force generators on. I almost forgot to put my pants on, which is always awkward. Now I am working on installing the motor. So they want you to install the screws and then back the screws out put some CA glue inside of the holes, and then let it dry and put it back together. And so that's what I did there. And now I'm looking for a good place to mount the ESC, and I am marking my center of gravity. I realized I should probably have my propeller on there if I'm doing my CG. So I got that installed. I have the battery resting on top on the right side of the plane in about the area I think it needs to go. I'm checking to see where the CG looks good with all of the equipment on. And then I'm going to cut a slot all the way through the top of the fuselage. That way I slide my battery through and it is set. So I use the battery as kind of a guide and get it into the right place, and then I'm able to get it cut all the way through. It's glued at the bottom because when I glued the top fuselage on, that part got glued, so it takes a little bit to get it out of there. So I'm using two different batteries. I'm using both a 3S and a 4S, and I'm making sure both of those are going to work correctly. And then I'm going to be gluing in the ESC permanently, and then I am done with the build. To finalize everything up, I mounted my ESC with some hot glue. I know some people don't like hot glue, but I do. I also mount my XT60 plug directly into it from underneath, so that way I can plug in my battery one-handed. I really love the full flying elevator on this plane, and I was also able to get a receiver put in without using any extension wires. I think the way that the gear is designed, it's going to hold up really well. Overall, I really enjoyed this build, and I hope that you did too. Don't forget to put your contact info and FAA number on your plane. And this concludes the build of the Crack PittsXL.